Recording started.
We've got about 175 individuals from across the country, mostly from California, registered for today's webinar. This is an experiment for the Foundation, so your feedback at the end will be greatly appreciated and will help inform whether we do similar webinars in the future. The folks who are on the call today represent a wide range of different kinds of organizations. We invited all of the Foundation's domestic violence and healthcare and coverage contacts. We have domestic violence, family violence, and sexual assault service organizations. We have advocacy organizations, coalitions. We also have a lot of community health centers, tribal agencies, health plans, academics, policymakers, and representatives from California's most important public agencies. So thanks for being here. Why are we here today? So as you know, Blue Shield of California Foundation supported a recent poll that surveyed public opinions and understanding of domestic violence in California. Historically, the majority of polling data in this field has been focused on DV victims. What's groundbreaking about this survey is that it's the first time, as far as we know, that we've broadened the conversation to include the general public. So the findings give us a never-before-seen look at Californians' perceptions and attitudes toward domestic violence. What the results mean for all of us is what we'll discuss here today. Quickly on logistics, if you've pre-registered for the webinar and are having any trouble logging into WebEx, you should have received the PowerPoint via email this morning from our Gmail email address at the Foundation, and you should be able to follow along on the PowerPoint on your computer in the audio. So we've done our best to make it possible for everyone to participate, so thanks. Joining us today are our expert presenters, Ben Tulchin and Melissa Dar Carvajal. Ben is the founder and president of Tulchin Research. They're a polling and political consulting organization. He has provided public opinion research, message development, and strategic consulting to some of the country's top nonprofits, businesses, and political candidates. Ben is an avid soccer fan and has been to the last 5 World Cups all around the world. Melissa is a vice president at Fenton Communications, a national communications firm that creates powerful issue-based campaigns to inspire progress and social change. Melissa, I understand, cooks a mean arroz con gris, which is Cuban black beans and rice. And in addition to her work at Fenton, she teaches Pilates in San Francisco. So the agenda for today, we'll present the poll findings for about 15 minutes. Then Melissa will discuss communications, implications, and opportunities. We'll have a short break for a couple of questions after Ben presents his key findings, and then again a break for a couple of more questions from Melissa after she discusses communications opportunities. You should have a chat box to the right of your screen. We'd like you to use that chat box only to submit questions. Given the number of people on the call, we're hoping that it can be used just for questions, only so we can easily sort them when it's time for the Q&A. But I think I'll hand things over to Ben. Are you ready?
Good morning. Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. We'll describe the methodology that we used for this survey and then go through the key findings that we thought would be most relevant for this group. We conducted this groundbreaking survey in October of last year, which of course is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we interviewed 900 adults in California ages 18 and older. We used a random digit dialing methodology, so we called using live telephone interviews, calling both landlines and cell phones. We conducted interviews in both English and Spanish, so in the overall margin of error, just to keep in mind, plus or minus 3.27%. So if we go to the slide of the findings, we asked basic awareness of domestic violence, October being Domestic Violence Month, and we found just under a quarter, 23% are aware of that fact, 75% not aware. So I think for all of us, we'd like to make some progress on that front, but that's a good start and a good foundational basis of awareness for October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And then you see the fact that we asked essentially the fact that domestic violence is personal for many Californians. 1 in 5 Californians report having been victims of domestic violence. Again, this is a survey and a unique survey asking about a very sensitive topic, and we've got a very honest, found to be an honest response from most adults. Other studies that are out there, mostly the Women's Health survey done by the state, focused on women particularly, but we all adults, and 29% of women report having been a victim of domestic violence in their lifetime, and 14% of men having reported being victims of domestic violence. So this is an issue that affects both men and women. Half of adults in California know a family member who's been a victim of domestic violence, and more than half know a friend. So clearly this is an issue that touches a majority of Californians. On the side, we see the act of the fact that Americans are more likely to know a victim of domestic violence, although if you look at those numbers on that slide, large numbers of Caucasians, Latinos, Asian Americans, and African Americans all know someone who's been a victim of domestic violence. So this is an issue that cuts across ethnic lines. And then there are some differences based on socioeconomic status. Lower income, middle income households are more likely to know someone who's been a victim of domestic violence, but upper income households report knowing someone as well, and including majorities in those income categories. So this is not an issue, as we're saying, that's only isolated to certain segments of our society. Next, this slide, we see that there are 2 core beliefs we found that the public has about domestic violence that really stood out that I think could shape our work on this issue. One is that domestic violence can happen to anyone, men or women, young or old, any rate, any income level. And 2, children exposed to domestic violence are more likely to fight mental health and anger management problems. The first one, that domestic violence can happen to anyone, quite frankly, going into the survey, we weren't sure what we were going to find, and whether one concern we had was if the public viewed it as an issue that only affected other people, it couldn't happen to me. But we found that was not the case, that this is an issue that many people feel affects themselves, their families, and their loved ones, and having that ability to connect with the public on a broader level, that this is an issue that does impact almost everyone, will help, I think, open doors in terms of communications. And children can be a very effective, powerful tool, I should say, in communicating this issue, because it evokes such a powerful emotion and an instant recognition that they're oftentimes the biggest victims of domestic violence, whether directly or indirectly. So we asked a range of things. So just those 2 items you see on the top of the graph, you see almost every adult in California views the statements as believable, whether domestic violence can happen to anyone. 98% believe that as believable. 54% view that as extremely believable. So just see how strongly that statement resonates. The fact that children being victims have real problems later on, 97% find that believable. But other facts resonate, not just to the same degree. You see the dark blue is extremely believable, and that really was what we look at, as well as the overall believability. But people who use their partners are very likely to also abuse children in the home. Again, having children as an issue here resonates. 4 million adults in California report being a victim of domestic violence in their lifetime. That resonates, but that's a slightly lower dark blue score. And I think some folks don't just have a concept of what 4 million means, whether that's a lot or a little. Statewide budget cuts have forced many domestic violence shelters to shut down or scale back services. 90% find that believable, 20% extremely believable. And that last part, given the state budget and elected officials in Sacramento saying the budget's balanced, the reality is that social services have been cut and a lot of funding hasn't been restored. So I think that last point is going to be helpful and an important message to communicate moving forward, to make sure the public knows that shelters still very much need funding. So similar to that core concept we discussed, an overwhelming majority think domestic violence can happen to them. 70% specifically responded that, yes, it can affect people like me and people I know well. Only 26% say it probably doesn't affect people like me and people I know well. And again, this was a surprise finding for us because we thought there would be a lot of folks just either thought it would be an issue that would never affect them, only a certain socioeconomic class, or just denial of the fact that, oh, it could never happen to me. So this was, quite frankly, an encouraging finding that there's a sense that this is a problem that could affect people directly. So on this slide, in terms of what could be effective solutions for addressing domestic violence, obviously this is the public's perception, not these aren't experts like yourselves, but we want to get a sense of what the public felt. And number one is educating young people so they have the skills to support safe and healthy relationships when they grow up. 95% felt that would be effective. 75%, see that dark blue, very effective. Number two, raising public awareness of domestic violence and speaking out against it. Ensuring that communities have the funding needed to support domestic violence shelters. Train officers, doctors, nurses, and others to identify the sign of domestic violence and to take action to stop it. 90+% effectiveness. And then the last one, provide support to veterans, families, and populations who are at higher risk for domestic violence. Did not quite as well as the others in terms of being effective. In part, we see other findings that the public does have a sense that certain communities have a higher rate of domestic violence than others. They feel everyone can be a victim of domestic violence. So that's one reason we highlighted a specific group in that one. And people said objective, but I think the sense we got was that feels everyone should get these programs, not just targeted groups. So, the fact that youth education is seen as the most effective solution, we want to emphasize that point because we were worried going to the survey that the public would be leery of, talking about a very sensitive subject like this to young people. And clearly, the public is open to having that discussion. All Californians support educating youth in schools, and to that point, specifically about concerns about sensitivity about discussing this issue, we asked whether it was appropriate to teach students or whether we should wait until at least the age of 18. 89% of Californians said, yes, it's appropriate to teach students, high school students. 80% said it's appropriate to teach middle school students. So again, we're on very solid ground here with educating young people, advocating for an effort to educate young people. And the public gets, like, they start at younger age, you're going to have more effective impact moving forward. In messaging, similar themes resonate with the messages, and Melissa from Fenton will go into a little bit more detail about how to, use this information. But we tested a range of messages to see which resonated the best, most effectively in terms of advocating for, raising awareness of domestic violence and increased funding for domestic violence prevention programs. So number one is all of our children should grow up experiencing safety in their homes and respect in relationships. And number two is everyone has the right to live free of violence in their homes. So those are the top two. The other messages did quite well, but we emphasized those two in bold. Again, the number one is children. The children theme here continues to pop consistently throughout the research, which is what we look for in survey research, a theme that stands out. And children really were a theme that stood out in multiple questions here.
Great.
And one last slide. So in terms of who the public trusts, someone who works at a domestic violence shelter, so you on this call may fit that bill. You are seen as very trustworthy. In fact, you scored the highest on this subject. Next, doctor, third, a friend, fourth is a mental health expert, counselor, psychologist, and fifth is a family member. We test a much longer list. These are the top-rated individuals or entities.
All right, thanks, Ben. We're going to provide a little bit more information about this poll to you via email after the call. This is Beth Bendet again, for those of you who might have come on a little bit late from Blue Shield of California Foundation. The structure of today's webinar allows us now to ask a couple of questions about the poll, Ben, about the methodology or key findings, now would be a good time to use your chat box if you have questions. We've got a few questions that have come in, and so I'll just try to keep us on schedule, and we can probably spend about 10 minutes on questions if we need that long with Ben. So, Ben, the first question that came in is, how did the poll define domestic violence? Ben, if you muted yourself, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I did. So let me pull that up. Let me come back to that in 1 second, and I will give that description in 1 second. So actually, I could pull up right now. So give me 1 second. So, how we described it was domestic violence, quote, I'm referring to abuse between spouses or intimate partners, which is the description that we saw a lot of the social research that had been done among victims had used to describe domestic violence. So that was the term we used when asking folks initially. Okay,
thanks. Another question is, you said that the poll was of both women and men, and we're wondering whether the responses were markedly different between genders.
They were, and I think I referenced that one question where, in terms of response of incident, reporting of whether they've been a victim of domestic violence, and that was a case where 22% of adults report having been a victim of domestic violence themselves, but that's 20% of women and 14% of men, so there are significant differences. Nevertheless, a lot of findings you see, the overwhelming unanimity among them about the messaging about children, as well as it could happen to anyone, cut across gender lines. So in that regard, in terms of messaging and our responses, we're very encouraged with just the solidly, overwhelmingly responses. There were no big gender difference on that regard, but we did see in terms of behavior responses, as I mentioned, there were gender differences.
Thanks. Just as a reminder for those of you who might have just come on the call, you can send questions to Ben via the chat box on the right. Any questions we don't get to today, we'll be able to send you answers to as an FAQ. Ben, another question that came in, which was a question that came to mind for me as well, is that some of these numbers in the poll don't reflect the standard data figures for domestic violence. This poll says about 1 in 3 versus what you'll commonly hear is 1 in 5 or 1 in 4. How do you account for that difference?
No, it's a good question. So based on all the research we were able to gather, the numbers are kind of all over the place, and the numbers I saw range from about 25 to 40%. So, for example, I know in one, the health survey, women's health survey, they only ask women under 65, so they didn't ask any women over 65, which affects the data, of course. So, and this is a telephone survey, anonymous and confidential, but there are, limitations to the methodology we use versus the women's health survey, which is a bit more sensitive and confidential. So I would say that numbers that are out there, I mean, this is the first time we asked the public, and again, with the methodology we use by phone survey, there are limitations to that methodology. So I don't think that how this compares to the women's health survey, there's a little bit more weight to it, I think, because it's a lot more interviews, a little more sensitive subjects, and a lot higher level of confidentiality. But again, they didn't talk to women over 65, so they're limited. It's a different universe than who we talk to. This was the first time anyone had tried to talk to all adults, both men and women, on this subject, and quite frankly, we were worried we'd get a much lower response than we did because, again, if you talk to a stranger over the phone and telling them about this, but we got very, rates that are in line with other surveys that are done in much more confidential format. So we were encouraged by the results and how honest people were, and I think partly because we discussed the issue a lot before we asked the question of whether they were victims or not, and that helped, people open up to us.
Great, thanks. Ben, another couple of questions that have come in have asked about geographic variance or variations in different counties or regions across the state. One question, I'll start with it just more general, is whether you saw any variations in different counties or regions, or where you saw that responses were relatively consistent across the state.
For the most part, they were quite consistent. And again, this is a representative statewide sample, so we did get adults, throughout state, Bay Area, LA County, Southern California, inland, coastal. However, you saw some of the differences on the slide. Socioeconomic, there were differences based on socioeconomic status and ethnicity. Not large differences, but those were where the notable differences are. So we found the regional differences weren't significant, but the socioeconomic differences and the ethnic differences were more gender differences based on self-reporting. So those were the variables that were big drivers than region.
Another question on geography, very specifically, was about awareness levels of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Because a lot of the agencies on the call do a lot of activity in October for DV Awareness Month, or even for February for Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. So more specifically, has there been any higher awareness levels for DVAM or DV Awareness Month in different regions? And if so, has there been any follow-up to find out what kind of outreach could be done in those areas, or has been done in those areas that was successful? I'm guessing the answer to that second part of the question is no, we haven't done follow-up, although it's a great idea. But Ben, have we seen any, sounds like you haven't really seen any geographic trends in the awareness levels, or what is the answer to that question?
Yes, so I mean, there are slight differences based on geography, but not statistically significant. San reported having the highest level of awareness at 31%. Sacramento and Northern California tied at 31%. And we should note that was one region state, Sacramento, Media Market, and North, that had reported relatively higher levels of domestic violence incidents. So the fact that there's higher awareness of it correlates with that finding. LA had the lowest reported at 20%, but anyone from LA County don't take that too much to heart, because it's the biggest media market, most expensive, and hardest to break through with any information. But those the difference is not great. But in terms of follow-up, I mean, this is our first of its kind survey, and we learned a lot from this survey, and hopefully we'll be able to do follow-up research in the future.
Thanks. I mean, I guess the one question that comes to mind for me as we at the Foundation think about doing a survey like this in the future, Ben, is do you tend to see changes just from year to year because of the state's familiarity with a survey like this? The value of doing it multiple years?
Yeah, absolutely. There is one of the hardest things about the survey was writing a survey that no one had written before. There's no kind of precedent for the questions we asked, and as everyone on this call can appreciate the sensitivity of the subject and how to talk about the subject and get answers from folks, from respondents. So that was one of the challenges we dealt with, and I think we learned a lot from this survey, and there's still a lot more moving forward. I think it'd be great if we could do this annually or regularly so you can track changes over time. Right? You've seen on big social issues, whether it's gun violence, on marriage equality, choice, or you may, there's tracking polling over time to show the fluctuations over time, and it would be wonderful to be able to do that with this issue.
Great. I think just to keep us on schedule here, I'm going to move us on a little bit. But, Ben, thank you so much for that overview. I'm going to move us on to Melissa at Fenton. Again, there will be time for questions at the end of Melissa's conversation, as well as more opportunities for follow-up after the webinar closes. So, Melissa, take it away.
Thank you very much, Beth. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about communications related to the poll on domestic violence. So talking today about ways to leverage the poll by presenting it, strengthen your position by incorporating the findings from the poll, and your messaging by using the public opinion research. We expect that you'll be customizing how you want to approach these ways of using communication in terms of your audience. So the audiences that we see that you would have would be policymakers, leaders and stakeholders, the vulnerable and victims, and family members of victims. And you would think about what kind of messaging, what kind of channels you would use in communicating with that audience. Example. A good target audience for a poll presentation are policymakers. Or use it to educate stakeholders and allies on how people think about domestic violence, just like we're doing now. You can use the poll findings to build support on issues that you're working on. For example, a recent poll shows that almost all Californians, San Diegoans know someone who's been a victim of domestic violence. When you look at the poll findings, we're hoping you'll look back at the poll findings and think about your work and be able to back up some of the issues you're working on by using those findings and talking about the existence of the poll. Next slide. You can also use the findings to make your work relevant or to support a particular program or focus of your work. For example, if you're talking to donors, you're talking about a program on your outreach to doctors, you would use the poll to show that a great majority of people trust doctors the most. So that's why, on the basis of that research, your program is a very effective way to reach out to professionals. Next slide, please. So you could use the research on people's opinions to inform your messaging, and we have a few recommendations on how to incorporate research on public opinion in your messaging that you use to your target audiences. And as Beth pointed out, one of the major findings of this survey was that almost everyone understands that domestic violence can happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime. That means that domestic violence is close to everybody, so that when you're talking and when you're thinking about how you talk about this, you're understanding that the audience you're talking to is coming from that perspective. You want to connect to understanding in your messaging. Next slide. Another major finding that Ben talked about was how talking about kids pulls at people's heartstrings. It's one of the strongest ways that we can resonate with our audiences by incorporating stories that include children. Connecting to that is a way to connect to your audience, even if it's not directly talking about children, but talking about family. Also, people connect to the value that each of us has the right to live free of violence in our own homes. Think about that when you're messaging about how your services help people in the community. Next slide, please. Research also showed us that focusing on solutions is a really effective way to communicate. And the findings show that people believe that services in the community are effective. Very strong support, over 90% for services in the community. And those include shelter services, education services, training. So you can be confident when you talk about solutions that that's a powerful way to gain support of your target audience. And so emphasizing empowerment. Our program protects victims and enables them to prevent further abuse. When we're talking to audiences, we want to focus on how the solution rather than the problem. We want to talk about how your service, your education, your shelter program puts people on the road to have healthy, safe relationships relationships and stops abuse. We want to link empowerment to the service that we provide in the community. So we're thinking about your poll information in your communication. The first point we really want to emphasize, and the tool that we hope you'll take a look at as well as the ones in front of you on the screen, is a PowerPoint that's going to be posted on the Blue Shield's website. That PowerPoint is an external PowerPoint that doesn't include the information about the messaging, but just about the poll. And it's a PowerPoint that you can use in talking to target audiences. So that will be posted, and you will have access to it. There's other tools that you'll be able to use in talking about the poll. There's an infographic that will also be posted on the Blue Shield website. There are memos on key findings that include geographic areas specifically. And we also have a template for releasing the poll. Those are tools that you can use to support your communications about the poll. Next slide, please. So finally, we want to have you think a little bit about all the different channels that you can use when you're communicating and which channel would work the best with which target audience. So you have your messaging for the target audience, and you also have which channel would work. You have a presentation we talked about for policymakers, or you could talk to a reporter in a newspaper thinking about a particular geographic audience that you want to talk about. Or you could talk about the results and have it read by stakeholders in your community. So thinking about the many different channels that we have available to communicate with our audiences. Finally, we hope you'll scroll back through this presentation and think about ways to connect the messaging and the channels to using the poll and its findings of your work in your community. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. So we'd like to take a few minutes to answer a couple of questions about communications and strategy. This question that we got is whether research has been published, and I think you partly answered that question when you talked about the fact that we were posting it on our website. That is about as far as we're going to publish it, and the additional documents that Melissa referenced will be up on our website. We're hoping to get them up by tomorrow. They will be published there, and we're hoping that you will help us publish that using the press release template and sharing it as widely as you can. Another question that came in is, do you think this poll is newsworthy enough to get it on local television? That's a good question. When I see polls like this, I'd be a little skeptical, like, so what? So what do you think, Melissa? Is this news, is this TV worthy? Not that TV has the highest standards, but what do you think?
Well, first of all, I want to point out that local TV is actually a great way to talk to your community. They're always looking for material and stories, especially if it has a personal edge to it and relevant to what's happening now. So instead of trying to pitch a story about the poll, I'd recommend cluing into what's happening in your community now, looking for stories in your community, and using the poll to back up the perspective that you want to promote on local TV. And of course, developing those relationships with local TV is very helpful. Having a reporter that you know that's interested in the issue or has done a story, and someone for whom you can be a resource, that kind of relationship is golden in terms of getting coverage on local TV.
Thanks, Melissa. Another question is a little bit more about influencing local county supervisors or policymakers. So the question is, I'd like to present the poll to our local county supervisors. Do you think it's appropriate? How would I go about this?
So just like probably many of you on the line, poll findings are interesting to people. They like reading about opinion, and especially people who work with the public and are interested in their votes. So I think it is something that policymakers and elected officials would be interested in. The question is how you get it to them. I mean, the idea of grabbing the local county supervisors and putting them in a room and presenting them this is probably unlikely. But there are lots of other ways to get information to the policymakers. You use it in a one-to-one way where you arrange for a meeting with the supervisor and come in and show them the poll and show them the results. Of course, if everybody's too busy for that, there are other channels. You can share it with them. You can have a conversation. You can blog about it and talk to the staff. So thinking about how to get the information the best way so that people really can listen to messages and link it to your policy or program initiatives.
Great, thanks. A few more questions have come in. One is, I'm trying to make sense of it. It says, who is a trustworthy source of help? And I think that might be a question back to Ben about who trustworthy sources were, unless you think that was directly related to your
No, I think it has the research been published for who is a trustworthy source of help.
I think that was a separate question that came in. So just raise a question and we can provide some more detailed information about the trustworthiness of various sources in terms of what the poll said about that. Another comment that came in, not a question, but a comment, is an important reminder to the Foundation and all of us, a recommendation to ensure communications are culturally competent and sensitive and to cater to immigrant populations. Thank you.
I actually have an idea about that, especially working locally. There are many great local channels that cater to different language population and also different ethnic populations. And that's a great way for you to use those smaller newspapers that cater to a particular community to get the information out. Of course, you want to think about what's the most important information for somebody picking up a local newspaper that's in Mandarin or a Spanish language newspaper, but you want to think about what you want to say, but those are really receptive to these kinds of stories. And, of course, thinking about when you're doing outreach and your messaging, how to make it culturally relevant, and that could be something that a future survey could investigate a little more deeply.
Great. Thank you. So I think we're going to try to wrap up and get everyone out of here at 11:45. I'm wondering, Ben, did you have any sort of final comments of things that you didn't get to say since we due to your strict 10-minute timeline? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, only quick thing, just in hearing some of the questions directed to Melissa. I mean, the fact that this is the first of its kind survey, as far as we know of, helps the newsworthy nature of it. And I agree with Melissa that the hook is the poll plus a little story, right? So you could share the poll in the context of a local story. And then if you have the memo that's available on the website, you can share that with elected officials. And it's a great, if you go into a talk to elected officials and you have an agenda, like you want to talk about the importance of funding domestic violence shelters, you say, well, the public supports this and thinks domestic violence is an important issue. So it's a tool that can be used in your toolbox for talking to electeds.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks to Ben and Melissa for your work on this. Just as a reminder, the publications page on the Foundation's website is where you can find the DV poll information, and also where we will be posting the additional tools that Melissa referenced. For any questions you submitted or that you would like to add, we were sending you a quick survey on today's webinar. It should take no more than 2 minutes for you to complete. You can pose questions there that come to you after the fact, and the survey will help us determine if we should conduct a DV poll like this again next year, how the information and the webinars like this can be most helpful to you. As I said, this is an experiment for the Foundation, and I just want to say on behalf of our presenters and all of us here at Blue Shield of California Foundation, thank you for the work that you do, first and foremost, and for joining us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Great day.